On the 23rd of July, 1535, inside of St James's Palace, the son of King Henry VIII, who was 17 at the time, succumbed to his final illness. He was a healthy child. However, in his teenage years, things took a turn for the worst. But this wasn't just Henry's son. This was a young boy who was possibly being groomed for kingship. You see, Henry Fitzroy was the king's illegitimate son, one of, it's believed, many, but the only one recognised by the notorious six-wived king. Fitzroy was bestowed huge titles, noble privileges, and he was even given the title of the Duke of Richmond, held by none other than Henry VIII's father, Henry VII. The truth is quite clear, with the king struggling to get a legitimate male heir. At a time when a daughter would not do, Henry VIII was preparing his illegitimate son to become the King of England and his successor, and he even received special permission from the Pope to possibly marry him off to his legitimate daughter Mary, strengthening his claim to the throne. But as mentioned, Fitzroy died young, and he was buried not once but twice, and today he rests inside of St Michael the Archangel Church in Framlingham. But why was he disturbed from his first resting place and grave? And why was his body dug up? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Fitzroy was born around mid-June 1519. His mother was one of Henry VIII's mistresses, Bessie or Elizabeth Blount, and she was actually a lady-in-waiting to Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And Fitzroy was actually conceived whilst Catherine was awaiting the birth of one of her children. So that shows you what kind of a man Henry VIII was. He was happy to sleep with his wife's close friends whilst his wife was giving birth. Anyway, Bessie Blount never returned to the royal court after Fitzroy's birth, and Henry VIII was enamoured with the fact he had a son. The baby boy's arrival caused no huge panic at court, but the king proudly showed him off. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey was the godfather and may have christened the child. Another man who had a keen role in Fitzroy's life was Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, a power-hungry man who was always seeking advancement. Howard was a skilled military commander, but he would later have a significant impact on the young boy's life. The fact the child was named Henry was after his father, the king, and Fitzroy meant son of the king. He stands out in history as the only illegitimate child of Henry VIII that he actually acknowledged. Fitzroy was given a royal upbringing inside of the royal nursery, and he was raised alongside other children, such as the king's legitimate children, Mary, Elizabeth and Edward. He was given a significantly decent upbringing and education too, and was referred to as Lord Henry. But the king had great plans for him. You see, Henry VIII lacked his male heir, and the only surviving child of his first marriage was Princess Mary. Henry Fitzroy was obviously being prepared for kingship, and the king's only living son looked like an attractive possibility to be the heir to the Tudor king. He was given his own residence at the age of 6 and was raised as if he was a prince of royal blood, not a royal bastard. He had this huge ceremony in the June of 1525 in which huge honours were bestowed upon him. Fitzroy was taken down the River Thames and was made the Duke of Richmond and Somerset in the presence of his father, and he was given the highest rank of the peerage. He also inherited much of the lands belonging to Margaret Beaufort, Henry VIII's grandmother, and the mother of King Henry VII. Henry VIII also granted him a rather huge annual gift of almost £5,000, a huge sum in today's money. The king was very proud of his son, and it was said that it seems that the Queen resents the earldom and dukedom conferred on the king's natural son and remains dissatisfied. At the instigation, it is said, of her 3 Spanish ladies, her chief counsellors, so that the king has dismissed them from court, a strong measure, but the Queen was obliged to submit and have patience. So Catherine of Aragon was not the happiest. And Fitzroy was also made a Knight of the Garter and the Earl of Nottingham, and was also made the Lord High Admiral of England and the Lord President of the Council. of the North, despite being a child. He was dealt with like a prince, being raised at Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire, but Henry VIII searched for a wife for Fitzroy and, as mentioned, he did consider marrying his daughter off to him, meaning that Fitzroy would have married his own half-sister. But then the influential Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, made a match between Fitzroy and Lady Mary Howard, his daughter. It is believed that Fitzroy was present at the execution of Anne Boleyn as a witness for the king, but he got sick in the July of 1536 and then succumbed to his ill health very quickly. It is believed that he died from tuberculosis or some issues with his lungs. He went downhill rapidly and died inside the Royal Palace of St James's in London on the 23rd of July 1536. The king was devastated, but his father-in-law took over the funeral arrangements. The Duke of Norfolk arranged for Fitzroy's body to be embalmed, and his internal organs were removed from his body, including his heart, and were placed in a separate box shortly after death. Then the body was wrapped in a thick cerecloth, practically mummifying the young teenager, and then the body was wrapped in lead and was placed inside of a coffin. Under the cover of darkness, the coffin of Fitzroy was taken out of London in a closed cart for a secret burial. The body was placed in a straw-filled wagon, and there were only 2 attendants acting as mourners. It's not known why there was so much secrecy, but this is what the king wanted. Fitzroy was buried inside of Thetford Priory in the Duke of Norfolk's lands, and in the burial place and mausoleum for members of the Howard family. But in the February of 1540, when the dissolution of the priories and the monasteries kicked in, Thetford was to be shut down. Howard appealed to the king to not close it, as his first wife and Fitzroy were buried there. The king ordered the priory closed, but the king also wrote to Howard saying how he was angry and upset that Fitzroy had been buried with no pomp and no ceremony. At some point, around 1540, the body of Henry Fitzroy was exhumed and taken out of the Howard mausoleum. The ground was broken and the coffin was placed on the back of a cart, which took it to Framlingham and specifically the Church of St Michael. This became the burial place of the Howards, and Fitzroy's body was interred inside of a grave within the main church, but this would be only temporary. You see, Thomas Howard had ordered 2 tombs to be made at Framlingham, one for himself and one for Fitzroy, but Howard fell from favour and was thrown inside the Tower of London, and the building work came to a halt. This was finished around the year 1555, meaning Fitzroy's tomb was finished almost 20 years after his death. He would then have been exhumed from his grave inside the church and then placed inside of the tomb. The tomb is a large chest without any effigies, but it is likely that these were intended to be placed on top of the tomb. The tomb is covered in Howard heraldic shields and scenes from the Old Testament, but it is believed today, as mentioned, that these were not the original tombs. However, there is another piece of information I can bring you that very few people, if any, know about. You see, inside of Framlingham Church in 1841, there was excavation work conducted under the tombs of Thomas Howard and Henry Fitzroy, right next to the altar. It was discovered under the floor that there was a vault, and inside of this vault were 2 bodies, one belonging presumably to Henry Fitzroy, and the other body being his wife, Mary Howard, who had died later. Now, Fitzroy's remains were described as having perfect teeth and of being of a young man. With this, we can conclude that the body of Fitzroy at some point had been disturbed and probably taken out of the cerecloth wrapping, with the body then exposed to the air and having decayed. There are examples of royal burials 500, 600 or even 700 years later being remarkably preserved due to the embalming. The fact that Fitzroy's teeth were perfect and were visible means that his skeleton was only left with the skin having decayed in the 500 years after his death. The removal of the protective cerecloth wrappings may have also been done in the many times that his body was moved or disturbed. Another thing to consider is the fact that Fitzroy is buried inside of a vault and not a tomb. Despite the fact that the tomb is large enough to house 2 bodies in coffins, it was traditional during the Tudor period for bodies to be placed in vaults underneath the tombs. For example, Elizabeth I and Mary I are buried in this way, as are Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. There are still many mysteries as to the death of Henry Fitzroy, the boy who could have very easily have been king. He'd have been King Henry IX today, as he is still buried under the floor of Framlingham Church, inside of a vault, but it is known that his coffin has been disturbed and his skeletal remains are present. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.